everybody. Good evening. Thanks very much for coming. Welcome. I'm René Morales. I'm a curator here at Pérez Art Museum Miami. For sharing your work. It's really such an incredible pleasure to have it on you here, and it's been such a pleasure to work with you and so in sync throughout this whole process. And it's really been a joy.
Thank you, I'm the same. It's rare to encounter somebody of such kindness and sharp intelligence, so it's really a pleasure here. Thanks.
So I wanted to just jump in and give a general overview of what's on view in the exhibition, especially for those who haven't had a chance to see it yet. The exhibition consists of 4 series from Victoria's production, representing or sampled from about 15 years worth of work. Victoria works very slowly, creates.
Yeah, the jewelry pieces take about a month. The beaded purses and the fur purses take anywhere from 3 to 4 months. And the beauty paintings also take a month, so it's a very, very slow, meditative kind of practice.
And this is this practice also is very disciplined. I mean, you work every day for several hours. It's incredibly kind of concentration and discipline that you bring to bear to your work. I think when you see the paintings in person, that kind of discipline and concentration is very apparent, very clear. So the first of these 4 series that we're showing in this exhibition consists of paintings of jewelry. You can really, if you look close, you can see her reflection in every single one of these pearls, and the facets, the quality of the rendering of the facets is just unbelievable. The next series, chronologically, more or less chronologically, her series tend to overlap chronologically, but the next one well, again, obviously these are paintings. For those who haven't caught that quite yet, these aren't the actual objects. These aren't photographs. These are small paintings. This one's particularly small, 6 by 7 inches, just about this size. And the next series. Written about quite beautifully by the critic Pérez in the catalog, but again, under a bonus for all. This one is rather atypically large, 14 by 15. This is in true scale. You can see there the painting on the left side. I'm sorry, the actual purse on the left side. And you're working with, can you talk a little bit about what you're holding in your hands there?
This was a photograph taken 2 weeks ago when I had a studio visit from some people from the museum, so I was showing them some of my paper. On my right, that's the one I'm working on, the paper palette, and you can see the colors are very similar to what's on the easel, the purse I'm working on now. But I say these paper palettes, I think I used to throw them away, but at some point I thought it would be a great idea to keep them to see what colors I used for past paintings in case I needed to fix something, but as a reference. And I also thought they were kind of interesting as objects, and you can see the process of basically, if you look at the palette I'm holding in my hand, you can see little clusters of paint, and basically each little cluster is a day of work. So I've been saving them. I don't know that I do anything with them, but throughout each paper palette is probably, I don't know, I go about 2 palettes or 3 palettes that might be like a month of work. So you can see actually how little each, I don't use that much paint because I only cover the little tiny, square centimeters each day. So, I'm just showing them because I think they reveal a lot about my process and how focused and small an area both of paint on my palette and on, paint surface. Every day is.
They're really interesting. Well, first of all, really beautiful just in their own right, I think, these palettes. But that's an interesting point about how they serve kind of as an index or a record of time from your life, which is a very important theme in your work, which we'll get to, I think, in this presentation. But, the paintings themselves serve that function of kind of recording time.
Yeah, well, they're tiny paintings. Most of them are 5 by 7 inches. And I've only done 6 of them, and the ones, this is the first time all 6 of them are seen together as a group. So that's something that I'm very happy about because I thought of them as a group from the beginning, but never had a chance to show them together. So they're small paintings on board that represent drawings by the 19th century French neoclassical artist Dominique Ingres. So these are paintings that represent drawings. So on board. And if you're familiar with his work, his drawings tend to be very gestural when it comes to clothing and the body and accessories, but then the faces tend to be very refined. But there's a very gestural and quick kind of notation that happens, in the body. So when I'm making these paintings, I'm actually replaying that in very slow motion, so that these things take about a month. And this series is a part of a larger kind of meta series that's called The Beauties, as René said. And it actually started with a series. You can go to the other slide. Yeah, we can go to
the next slide.
Yeah.
I'll mention just briefly, the museum is a proud owner of this piece, which is donated in honor of Linda Montage. That's in our collection.
Yeah, so starting with the Renaissance up to the 19th century. This is a portrait of by Parmigianino of a woman of very ideal beauty. So I think we wanted to talk about this work in particular because a lot of the things that have developed over the years in my work really go back to looking at these Renaissance portraits of idealized women, such as the one that Parmigianino's portrait of a woman, I think it's called Antia. And what I was interested about at the beginning was this kind of conflation that happens between the representation of beauty and the beauty, the woman herself who's represented. So that's something that carries on, I think, from the last 15 years. It's a thing that carries on. And then the jewelry pieces and the beaded purses and the fur purses kind of evolved also out of my interest in some of the things that these women are wearing. You have this jewelry that's on her and this piece of fur that's that she has here. And in a sense, there's more individuality and specificity in the accessories that adorn her, whereas she's a very idealized beauty. So that was part of what prompted me at some point to do this first little portrait of the necklace, because I thought in a sense, that kind of was a comment on how it's almost like the portrait of the jewelry is more specific and individual than the portrait of the woman.
Yeah, that's true. And with the later series, it's almost as if you've extrapolated the jewelry of these women or the fur. It's really striking how when you look through the old masters, and your work obviously is very closely engaged with the old masters, you've noticed this right away. You notice this mere obsession, this fixation on those kinds of things, like the jewelry, the reflection on the pearl necklace, the tactile quality of the fur. Obviously your work is really tuning in to that tendency. So I wanted to show, I was trying to think of a particular old master painting that called that to mind for me. And I remember a few years ago, I was walking through the National Gallery and I saw this painting by Van Eyck. This is just special. You can almost extrapolate from the visual quality of that representation, the state of the technology of glass in those days. You can extrapolate so much besides just the purely visual and sensual. But I think that really plays into your work as well. It's a definitely part of your this connection with the old masters at Holbein. In particular, I keep thinking of the Northern Renaissance, which has this very strong Johannes Kepler and Copernicus and scientists who were exploring the science of optics. Optics was definitely a central part of the science of the time. That was certainly the case with Holbein. And I thought in particular of this painting of Thomas More, which is a Frick in New York. His delectation and the rendering of of course, the velvet on the sleeve, but also the fur.
I think there's something about the Northern Renaissance that really relates to some of my concerns that, I haven't thought about it so much, but when you brought all these examples of just like Northern Renaissance versus Italian Renaissance, that I think the Italian Renaissance interests me more in terms of idealization and representations of beauty, but in terms of my approach to actual painting, I think the Northern Renaissance masters had a kind of interest in the way paint, and oil paint in particular, can embody a kind of tactile quality that and their emphasis on the director's observation and how this almost like very focused
So the more we've spoken over the last few months, the more it's become really clear to me that this idea of this optical tactility, this idea of visual kind of touching, is really very central idea in your work. As it was with the old masters. And if you look at, if we go back to the fur, for example, I think that's an excellent way of eliciting that sense of optical tactility. Certainly there were other meanings attached to things like fur, things like the jewelry. Certainly part of the idea was to reveal the status of the sitters, the paintings. I think you're also kind of honing in and harnessing you start to connect with some of these kind of inherent associations that these materials have, particular fur. One of them is this idea of this kind of the raw and the cooked. This is something that association with death and with mortality and with this kind of raw, primal kind of quality.
I think part of what's interesting about that connection is that on the one hand these are very decorative things, these are purses and they're very luxurious and they're about fashion, but because they're fur, there's an almost underlying melancholy about them because death is almost like inscribed in them. So that interrupts the very decorative quality of these purses. So that's something that it's there underneath as a
I get that sensation when I look at an old master painting of this. This person, time is unforgiving. Fur has often had an erotic association in Western art also. I think that's a very important dimension in your work as well. Brought forth in this discussion of eroticism in the old masters. And it runs through undercurrent in this artwork. Here we're fast forwarding all the way to the early 20th century in the context of the surrealists. But again, it's eliciting this very specific kind of tactility, sensuality, with a very strong gender dimension. So this might be a good moment to talk about.
I think one of the things that's over the years as I focused more and more on this idea of tactility, I've been thinking of the ways in which we respond, obviously in numeric art, when we were looking at the Chardin or we were looking at the Holbein, even the Rubens. Like in the Danaid, the image itself elicits a tactile response, but I'm also interested in the tactile response of the paint surface itself, so that, on one level it's the image that elicits that tactile desire, but on a more basic level, even if we look at abstract, contemporary or modernist art, that the paint surface itself, still, even if it's an abstract surface, whether it's very juicy painting or very dry painting or very velvety or feathery painting, it's almost like you touch the painting surface with your eyes, so it's a very kind of intimate tactile exchange that happens between the viewer's eyes and the surface of the painting. And if you really think about it, I think traditionally, that we tend to identify that skin of painting as coated as a feminine surface, and implicitly the gaze that looks at that surface is a male gaze. So in a sense, if you look, for example, if we go back to over here, this is I'm using the fur almost to make literal that tactile desire, that tactile quality that paint itself has. So this is almost like the verb makes literal that desire to touch paint. And here I'm just, as you notice in all these series, I'm placing the object, in this case the Pérez, parallel to the picture plane, so it's flat and posed frontally. So I'm basically equating that first surface with the surface of the painting, and because this is a feminine object, this is a Pérez, I'm basically equating the painted surface as a feminine surface.
Yeah, and it functions interestingly in the jewelry paintings, right? In the necklaces, it's almost as if the picture plane is a woman's chest.
Right.
You know, it's almost like an anthropomorphization that's happening.
Right, so the painting itself is the woman.
Yeah. So, returning to this idea, this compositional strategy, whereby the imagery is kind of pressed up to the picture plane. This is an idea that we very much associate with modernist painting, modernism, where the imagery and the surface become identical. They become synonymous. So I think very clearly in your work, you're as much as you're engaging the old masters, you're also very much engaging modernist painting. And so just to give a few examples of this. First, going
itself that has that tactile look. So, but it's still a very optical image, you know. So it's that conflation of touching with the eyes, which is so essential to the medium of painting.
And of course, what you're doing is representational painting, highly representational painting. So it's there's this paradox that I think is really interesting, creates attention in your work, whereby, how did you phrase it once? It's a representational tradition rooted in the old masters, and approaching the old masters through a compositional strategy associated with the modernists. So it's this kind of simultaneous occurrence.
Yeah, and I think obviously, this is a more direct reference to, a Riemann, in my mind. I buy these things on eBay. These purses are vintage purses, mostly that I can remember. So when I saw this, on the computer screen, so to me it's like, I was looking at a Riemann painting, so I'm equating, that very curly kind of paint handling by Riemann to this very curly fur image. But I'm talking about tactility. My paintings are not very thick, even though a lot of people say my paintings look like photographs. I know it's meant as a compliment, but to me, there's something so physical about oil paint on board, even if it's not thickly handled. There's something super material and embodied about a Van Eyck painting, even though there's it's not like a Rubens or a Titian, but it's still, painting is so physical. Even if it's thinly or flatly painted, it's still, it's this matter, that
It has a presence.
It has a presence that's so different from photography or an image on a screen. So.
In fact, I hope everyone has a chance to go and see the show so that you can kind of compare the experience of seeing this work in this photographic format here, and when you see it in person, I think you'll have a pretty good sense of what
especially also the scale, because
yeah, it's really bizarre to see these things blown up at such a huge scale when they're really so small. With this piece, you were really thinking about Riemann when you purchased it.
Right. I'll see something and it will remind me of somebody's work. And And sometimes it's not such a direct allusion as this, sometimes it's more just like a general feeling of this looks painterly somehow.
So we have a whole series of juxtapositions. It would be a shame to kind of overwhelm the interpretation of the work with this idea of a reference. The references, I think, are operating in a way just to kind of indicate, to give a hint at some of these other ideas that you're getting at about compositional strategies, tactility, these kinds of issues that run through the entire tradition of Western art. This is the first step throughout this whole process. We've been referring to it as your abex.
Because it feels like when I saw this, there's a kind of energy that it's almost like type of very gestural brushwork that here becomes and that's the thing about the fur purse is that fur is something that has direction. Becoming literal in the fur as something very tactile.
That makes me think of actually this moment when you were describing your transition between the beaded purses, which are very rigid, and it's a hard material, it's glass or plastic, and the fur purses. And when you described it to me, it sounded almost as if you went into like a crisis.
It was very difficult because it's like my day. For so many years when I was working on the beaded purses, it was really structured around this grid that, had an inner logic, and I knew that, basically every day I would paint about 30 beads or so. So it's like, there was a certainty to every day, because I paint about 7 or 8 hours with it, 1.5 hour, 2 hour breaking the needle, but it's a very repetitive routine every day. I don't know, since I guess 2003 until 2011, I was doing 2 different series of beaded purses, very different from one another, but still beaded. So I had, years of like waking up knowing in a way exactly what my day would be like, and then switching to the fur purses. I suddenly encountered something that was obviously without a grid, without borders, without outlines, shapeless, because you have like all these hairs that they're not solid and they're not the logic of like how do I know, because I do like a little tiny piece of painting every day, like how do I delineate what will be today's work?
Yeah, it's like chaos. We
Yes.
look at it.
It was too until I got used to this, it was too months of like, upheaval.
Well, it's just interesting because it's I think one of the kind of broader, more general ideas or sensations or feelings that I've often gotten from your work is the kind of power or the kind of immensity that one discovers by simplifying and by looking very closely. It's almost like the more closely you look, the more complex a thing is. So here's another. to a certain combination of colors in the purse itself to create the background, or not necessarily?
Sometimes, I mean, the backgrounds in this new series of third purses and the color beaded purses became very active in terms of my previous body of work was the body of all white beaded purses, so it was almost a monochromatic series with very gray, neutral, creamy backgrounds. So when I started working on these color beaded purses and these color fur purses, it's almost like they necessitated a very much more active background. The way I work is very unorthodox because like I work on the purse itself for 3 or 4 months until I actually finish it and not know until the very end what my background will be. I mean, sometimes I have an idea, but I totally change it at the end. So basically, it's, I work for 3 months and then like in a week the painting will change completely. I knew when I started with this one that it would be some kind of thing, but sometimes I have no idea. So, and then when I work on the background, sometimes that means I have to go back to the purse and rework some of the things that are happening inside the purse.
So this was a very literal juxtaposition here, but again, going back to more general. Color, it was kind of, I was looking for an Albers that is as close as possible in tonality to this one, but I don't think you were literally thinking of a particular Albers painting. Ironically, I'll just mention as an aside, this painting this is Albers' very first homage to the square, and it belongs to a collector who's been very supportive of Victorian's work. It's just, ironically, it's a very strong relationship. But in this case, the reference has much more to do with the composition.
Yeah, it's basically because that purse is so squarish, I was thinking of Albers. So I placed it, if we go back, you can see it just placed slightly lower, not as low as Albers, but just, that kind of pressure down of the square.
Yeah, it creates this sense of pressure. Slightly lower than it normally would. I hope that in the show it creates that very subtle sense of pressure. Here's another just. The adjacency of the form to the edges.
And this is one where I saw the purse. The painted surface of, only 20th century abstraction becomes miniaturized because these are very tiny paintings, and also it's almost like the beads are kind of like a crystallized standing for that tactility, that paint, a very, very different kind of tactility, but so you get it, it's miniaturized and it's crystallized somehow, so it makes it all the more of a fetish, there's already a fetishistic aspect to, wanting to touch painting. So this is actually right. I mean, one of the things we talked about was titling the show "Non in a Tangere," which is a phrase from And to me, you just take that first, that will mostly get, an elevation, something.
It could have been
It
painted
could,
by one
right,
of his painters.
right. So,
If one could argue, one could see sort of kind of Nolan or we've mentioned Craig Kaufman, this California sculptor who creates these lozenge-like forms. But again, it was much more of a general feeling modernist composition in this case. And so is this one.
yes. Which is usually very rational and rigid, but here you have it embodied in this raw organic material with all these associations to death, as we spoke about before, and the erotic. So it's it's almost like the grid becomes a totally different thing, and you have this kind of tension and contrast between something very rational and something very raw and almost emotional.
Certainly, and I think what you just said is a really good capture of your work in general. That very strong sense of rationality, intellect, with emotion and sensuality. So up to now we've talked about the old masters, we've talked about modernism, but in many ways, your work is very closely related to subsequent artistic tendencies. So I wanted to go through that a little bit. Reinforce this idea of commodity, the generic seriality, one thing after another. These are themes that became extremely important, not just in pop art, but later in minimalism and conceptual art. And that's something that very much happens in your work. This is also a sense of typology, which is another really important idea in contemporary art. The idea of breaking things down into certain typologies. This series of beauties is almost like you're creating a typology of beauty, of female beauty.
It can be thought of also almost like as a taxonomy, there will almost be specimens, so it's a very rigorous studying of something.
So you're taking the thing that most resists taxonomy and analysis of beauty, sensuality, and forcing it into this format. But again, this idea of typology, taxonomy is extremely important in contemporary art. Of course, the Bescher is very And then there's one other concept, and I think this might be the last idea that we talked about in that last slide. The idea of object expressionism. Here we're going after this kind of period of high modernism. You can point to many different places as points of origin. The Jasper Johns is one that I always think of, this famous painting, Flag, which is a painting of a flag at the same time that it is a flag. It is a flag. So that kind of equation of the thing and the representation is something that's quite almost starts to feel like it's an actual, it really feels like an actual purse that's kind of hovering, like levitating in the wall, just coincidentally creating that effect, and where I get that sense of the importance of objective.
Well, I think what's obviously very different from John's is that, you know, my objects are obviously illusionistic, and in the case of these works, you know, they don't, the purse itself doesn't, you know, occupy the whole space in the way that the John's image represents, you know, the whole painting. But when we talk about, I think, objecthood in my work, it's this sense that you have, you know, this very formal frontal presentation, and it's almost like I think the works themselves have a kind of objecthood about them, or the whole, you know, because they're so like factual and matter of fact, but of course they're so illusionistic, so there's something very almost opposite to what Jones was doing. But it was my train of thought. Yeah, so what I was thinking is that the purse itself is so much an object, but that I'm approaching this idea of objecthood from something that's almost, you know, totally contrary to what, you know, modernist painting was trying to do, because, you know, it's
absolutely.
Exactly. So it kind of has the, you know, the feeling of objecthood, and kind of like something that just sits there, because these paintings, even though they're very illusionistic and representational, they're almost like mute in a way, like they're just there. And I don't know how else to say it other than there's something very reticent about them. And I think part of what interests me very deeply in the relationship between painting as an object and the beholder is the kind of the circuits of desire between the viewer and the object. And part of, you know, modernist paintings' aim in terms of desire is almost to negate it, like they're there, but they don't want you to want them. I think these works, in a way, you know, do both things at the same time. They're very seductive. You know, obviously I'm trying to create an image that's very sensual and very tactile, and you almost want to touch it, and they're really attractive things. But at the same time, there's something very, you know,
reticent,
and it's something that, you know, just wants to sit there and ignore the viewer at the same time. So it's this, you know, push-pull where, you know, there's, you know, that
detached quality.
A detached quality where I'm basically at the same time, well, not me, but the painting is at the same time ignoring the viewer, but also like, you know, trying to draw you in.
Let's go back a second. When you were talking about Jasper Johns, and you mentioned how, you know, as much as this approaches Jasper Johns in the way that, you know, Jasper Johns' flag is a representation of a flag, but it also is literally a flag. You're approaching that kind of equation illusionistically, right? By virtue of the high degree of realism. It is a painting of a person, but it almost a person. You almost feel it as a person. But then you said that the one major difference here is that you're still working within the window, the pictorial window. You know, the purse doesn't go to the edges the way that it does with Jasper Johns. But you know, if we talk about the beauties,
Painting is the drawing, so this is not like John's in a way, that the object is the representation.
and yet these are well, I think I mentioned earlier that you paint at a 1-to-1 scale, and you paint from life, but that's not the case with the beauties. And the beauties you're working, first of all, you're working from a photographic representation most of the time. And they're smaller, they're reduced. Right? So what about that shift in scale?
I think with the beauty series, basically I'm miniaturizing these women and these representations. And that's something that only happens in the beauty series, not in the, all the objects are one-to-one, and that's part of what, that factual.
Part of that
Objectual and factual quality we talked about before. But all the beauties, I think all the beauty series are done and reducing the scale quite a lot. And I think when you reduce these images so much, again, it forces you to come in very close and have a very intimate relationship. So again, I'm interested in that line that happens between the viewer size and the object, and that kind of intimacy. And I think when you shrink something so much, it exaggerates that fetishistic character.
The circuits of desire, as they phrase it.
Yeah. So I think making these things small, which are kind of precious to start with, makes them even more precious. So it pushes that even further.
Labor intensive, and they were just very difficult. It was very taxing, a very challenging project. Right? You essentially have to teach yourself how to render the look of graphite, the look of pencil on paper with oil and paint. And so can you talk a little bit about that process of learning and the difficulties involved there?
Basically, every time I start the series, it's, whether it's beads or the jewelry or the fur or this, it's like I have to figure out a way of how I can represent the material quality in this case of graphite or fur, but each different kind of material requires a different kind of paint handling. Like with the beaded purses, my brushes were really tiny, and it was a very kind of tight and small gesture because each bead is so small, so there's never anything like that or anything like that happening. But with the fur, we have to switch brushes, and even though it's a very precise rendering, that still requires a looser kind of handling, otherwise the hairs become very stiff. And then to do graphite, I don't even remember exactly how I did it now. But yeah, I had to figure out that. Basically what it means in this case is that, as I said before, the face is very very precise in the rendering and very refined, but everything else, like what you're seeing, yeah, so you see the face is very refined. But then the detail we were seeing now, the original drawing, those are very fast gestures, so they're, you can almost, feel the wrist movement of, doing that, but it's something very fast. So when I'm doing it with paint, brush, I'm really trying to reproduce, the hardness of the pencil, how the pressure, when it becomes thin, it becomes dark. It's something very slow, so it's almost like I'm reenacting those quick notations of the pencil, something very, very slow, and in a way, because I'm slowing that process down, I think it kind of exposes the mark in a way that maybe when you look at a drawing, you look at it like in a different way. Like this is something where the mark itself becomes the subject of my painting. So the mark itself, again, becomes almost like, like a fetish when it's replayed, but it's also, that slowing down, I think, hopefully makes the viewer look at the painting at my pace somehow, that my slowing down is reflected in the viewer slowing down to look at these things.
Yeah, certainly. And we've had conversations along these lines in the past, and often what comes to mind is an artist, a painter that might not seem very closely related. In fact, I think is really, the more I think about it, the more it feels quite strongly related. Aura. If any of you are in New York, I haven't seen it, but I would have. Primarily, I guess you can't see them at all here. And even that title kind of reinforces what he's trying to. So basically, you would paint one of these in a day. He had one day to make this painting here. So it becomes, and often they come in these boxes in which he includes newspaper clippings from that day. This one I was attracted to because it has those words "ultima hora." Again, I think it was very intentional on his part in reinforcing that sense of nowness. That idea of using painting as a way of registering, of indexing the literal lifetime of the artist is something that is a very subtle layer in your work, and that maybe doesn't come across right away. But I think once you register many of the things that we've been talking about, it starts to really come out as primary.
Because these things, basically, because I'm doing like a little section of paint every day, is like the addition of daily routines of painting, of days of life, really, are kind of built into the painting. So that sense of time, I definitely think is very
Your
much.
life is built into the painting.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think maybe we ran a little late, but I think we still have time for some questions. If anyone.
We'll pass the mics around so that we can all hear your questions.
I guess I was wondering, you kind of disavowed this photographic parallel in your work, and you were very clear and illuminating in this idea that it's painted from life and what that means. But I think in this other way, there's this obvious, or I wonder how photography does paint it, because there's a hyper reality to the works. They're more real than real, which I think is something, particularly in the contemporary, that we associate with digital technology and even that ability to zoom in so much and all these kinds of things. So I wonder if in your thinking or your process, how you situate yourself kind of within that kind of conversation, if you would.
But I haven't really thought of my work in relation to, because of the digital hyperrealism, so that's not something I thought about. I do think because of the material quality of the oil paint and the surface, they are more real than, they feel more real than photograph. There's certainly some photographers that, capture that, there's a really strong tactile quality into the way the images are printed, the photographs are printed. So, but I think that hyperrealism is something, that's present in Van Eyck as well. That, in a sense, like Van Eyck is so much more real than any photograph because it's embodied in the paint, or because of the presence that paint has, that painting has.
Yeah, so at the same time, though, if you look back at the literature, the art historical criticism from modernism, photography was always this kind of latent factor, and in fact, that emphasis on tactility existed very much in the field of masterism before modernism, but it took on a new life and a greater intensity, I think, with modernism because of photography. I think because of photographic representation, that tactility was identified as the thing that painting had that photography could never have, and a lot of its value was placed on that tactility.
And it's a very particular kind of tactility where it's merged with opticality. So, it's a tactility that's very different from sculpture, which can be very tactile as well. But then, instead, paint is like the skin somehow.
Yeah, sculpture and painting to some extent, besides photography, it was also the specter of the ready-made, or the specter of factory-made objects. You know, things that did not have that tactile quality, that did not have that sense of the hand that served that same kind of purpose as a way of distinguishing that art form from other things. And like serving